This is Talk, and 12:52 is the time. I'm Julia Hartley-Brewer. Philip Ingram's still with me. Good to have a defence expert in the studio. Also got defence historian and writer with The Spectator, actually, Eliot Wilson, who joins us right now to talk about where we are on issues of defence. Good afternoon to you, Eliot.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Appreciate you joining us. Now, we talked a little bit around the houses with Steve Gill on this, but specifically on this NATO summit today, where we've got all the defence ministers and secretaries of state from NATO members, and they appear, we understand, according to sources, to be getting close to a consensus on a 5% minimum spend of GDP on defence. Now, we've just had this big row here in the UK about going from 2.3% to 2.5%. And now even, it talks about, is the government reneging on the ambition, or whatever word the government is using this week, on moving to 3% sometime in the next decade. A lot of people who understand this stuff saying that's way too late and way too little. But what do you make of a possible agreement at 5%, given, and you've worked in Commons a long time, given where public finances right now are?
Well, I think from Keir Starmer's point of view, things have moved extremely quickly. When he announced in February that we were going to increase from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% by basically emptying the overseas aid budget, that was quite a step forward. And then he was talking about an ambition to go to 3% sometime in the next Parliament. That seemed as if it was a step forward, but suddenly there's been a sea change in NATO membership, and the NATO member states are now saying, no, we need to go far further than that. We need to be realistic and face the threats we are being faced by.
What's changed, though? Well, I mean, they've definitely changed the perspective, although we understand behind the scenes a lot of this has been called for. We know what Donald Trump has been saying since his first term in office, that, taxpayers in America shouldn't be funding the defence of Europe. European people should be doing so. But what has suddenly happened in the last few weeks, month or so, that has changed the perspective on how seriously European members of NATO need to take this?
I think mainly it's finally dawned on European members of NATO that Donald Trump is serious about this, that he's not just blowing hot air, that it's not just some idle threat, that he genuinely probably won't withdraw from NATO, because that'd be quite difficult constitutionally.
Yeah.
But he could effectively just say, no, you're on your own, we're not devoting any significant resources to it. And I think European member states have suddenly realised that this could happen, and that the war in Ukraine is still going on, that Putin is still a clear and present danger to European security. And so that we do need to do something serious. And there has emerged this consensus that Mark Rutte was talking about last week of 5% of GDP, which, to be fair, is going to be split probably between 3.5% on sort of core defence capabilities, and then 1.5% on infrastructure around that. But still,
sort of cyber, border security, and things like that included in that.
Far in advance of anything that the UK is prepared to talk about at the moment.
And we're talking about huge sums of money as well. But I mean, I don't want to come to the actual number sums, because when people talk about whatever percentage of GDP, 2.3, 2.5, 3, 5, whatever it is, what does that actually mean in real money? But it is interesting. I mean, I think Americans would be crazy to try and go isolationist, but this isn't really about being an isolationist United States. This is about dealing with stuff also on their own back door in the other direction. Yeah, we focus everything on the Atlantic, but actually what's going on in the South China Seas, in the Pacific, is of even more concern to the Americans, and actually a massive concern to the world economy in terms of the threat that China poses to Taiwan. And we've had, leading figures. I mean, Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of State for Defence, saying, there's going to be an attack imminently. They're building up their forces. They're spending a huge proportion of their GDP on military. Why would they be doing that if they weren't planning something which they've said they will do, seizing Taiwan by whatever means necessary? It's perfectly reasonable for America to say, look, we can't be dealing with Europe and paying for everything going on in Europe and Russia and Ukraine at the same time as dealing with China, which is a much more significant military threat to the world.
I think, the Americans have made a reprioritization of their resources, and that's reasonable. I think they underestimate how important internationally European security is, but they're quite right to focus on China and the South China Sea. Xi Jinping has been saying for some time that the reunification, as he calls it, of China and Taiwan is a critical part of his mission as president. He's going to do something. Something will happen probably within the next couple of years, if not a full-scale invasion, although I think that's looking more likely than it was. Some kind of blockade, some kind of major cyber attack. Yeah. And that's going to ask very major questions of America's policy. Yeah. America is bound by treaty to supply Taiwan with defensive capabilities. It's not bound to go to its military assistance necessarily, though it can do so. And Trump's been very,
He's been very cagey about that, hasn't he? And again, I think, again, the best way, as we know, best way of deflecting and deterring these sorts of attacks is to make it clear that you would come to the aid. What sort of numbers are we talking about when we're talking about 5% of GDP, though, in terms of the actual spend? How big an increase would it be on where we are now?
Well, I mean, the MOD's budget at the moment is something like 55, 60 billion a year. So we'd be talking about going well towards 100 billion.
So at least another 40 billion a year being spent.
That's the sort of money we're talking.
And we're going to. I mean, I'm going to look down the back of the sofa when I get home later, and I'm wondering where they're going to find that.
Well, I think play the lottery is the key thing here, Julie. Every little helps. But no, I mean, it's going to be a very painful matter of priorities, because even if the government's economic strategy, such as it is, eventually produces some growth, there's going to be money found from somewhere.
Yeah, it's not producing 40 billion, is it? Thank you very much, Eliot Wilson. Really good to have your analysis. Thank you very much, writer and historian Eliot Wilson. Philip Ingram, very brief response to that, please.
Well, very, very briefly, current defence budget 65.6 billion. 3% is up to 85.6 billion, which is what the government has got an ambition to. 3.5% is up to 100 billion, and 5% is 142 billion.
And we're that £22 billion black hole's looking like a joy right now. That's the sunny day.
It shows the government has done no planning whatsoever.
Well, neither did the last lot, and neither did the ones before
the last lot didn't.
Everyone's had their head in the sand.
Exactly, but this lot are putting out plans. They haven't looked at what's happening in the future.
Absolutely. God, it's another happy show.